The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window, watching the world begin another day. She had no idea that within hours, the nation would be plunged into mourning, and she and William would find themselves at the center of a moment that would define their roles as future monarchs. The phone call came at precisely 7:43 a.m. William's private secretary, his voice trembling with the weight of the news he carried, delivered words that would echo through the corridors of Buckingham Palace and into the hearts of millions. A beloved figure in British society had passed away unexpectedly during the night. The details were still emerging, but one thing was certain: the nation needed its royal family now more than ever. Catherine set down her morning tea, the delicate china cup rattling against its saucer as her hand shook slightly. She had grown accustomed to the weight of royal responsibility over the years, but moments like these still caught her off guard. The transformation from Kate Middleton, the girl from Berkshire, to the Princess of Wales was complete in title. But the emotional journey continued with each national crisis, each moment when the people looked to the royal family for comfort and guidance. William appeared in the doorway, his face grave but composed. His training as a future king had prepared him for moments like these. Yet Catherine could see the very human concern in his eyes. They had learned to read each other's emotions in the subtle language that years of marriage and shared public service had taught them. Without words, they both understood what lay ahead, a day that would test their ability to represent the nation's grief while managing their own emotions. The next few hours passed in a blur of telephone calls, hastily arranged meetings, and careful coordination with Buckingham Palace. The King's office was already working on an official statement. While William and Catherine's team began planning their response, every word would be scrutinized, every gesture analyzed. In moments of national mourning, the royal family became a mirror for the country's emotions, and they had learned to carry this responsibility with grace. As Catherine changed from her casual morning clothes into something more appropriate for the solemn day ahead, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Ago, as a university student at St. Andrews, she could never have imagined standing in a royal residence preparing to help a nation through its grief. The girl who had once been photographed in jeans and casual sweaters was now expected to embody dignity and comfort for millions of people she would never meet, but whose lives she touched through her public role. The palace staff moved with practiced efficiency around them, understanding without being told that this was no ordinary day. Phone calls came from officials across the Commonwealth, from prime ministers and presidents, from religious leaders and charity heads. The ripple effects of the morning's news were spreading across the globe, but the epicenter remained here, in the heart of the British establishment, where William and Catherine stood as representatives of continuity and stability. By mid-morning, they were in the car, traveling through London's streets that seemed different somehow. People walked more slowly, gathered in small groups, their faces reflecting the shock that was spreading through the country. Catherine watched from behind the tinted windows as ordinary citizens processed the news, some wiping away tears, others simply standing in contemplative silence. These were the people she and William served, the faces behind the statistics and polling numbers that the officials often quoted. The first public appearance of the day was at a hastily arranged engagement that had taken on new meaning. Was meant to be a routine visit to a community center, had become an opportunity for the royal couple to be present with people who were struggling to make sense of the morning's tragic news. As their car pulled up to the building, Catherine could see the crowd that had gathered larger than expected. People who had come not just to see the royals, but to be part of something bigger than themselves. Stepping out of the car, William offered his arm to Catherine in a gesture that had become natural over their years of marriage. The crowd was quieter than usual, the typical cheers and waves replaced by respectful applause and solemn nods. Children still held flowers and homemade signs, but even they seemed to understand that this was different from other royal visits they had seen on television or heard about from their parents as they walked toward the community center entrance. An elderly woman in the crowd called out to Catherine. Her voice carried the weight of genuine emotion as she said, "Thank you for being here, Your Royal Highness. Needed to see you today." Catherine paused, breaking protocol slightly to approach the barrier and take the woman's hand. This simple gesture, lasting only a few seconds, was captured by the photographers present and would later become one of the defining images of the day. Inside the community center, they met with local leaders, charity workers, and volunteers who were already organizing support for those most affected by the morning's tragic news. Catherine found herself drawn to the practical details of how communities come together in times of crisis. Her background in charitable work had taught her that grief often manifests in the desire to do something, to help, to make a difference in whatever small way possible. William, meanwhile, spoke with emergency responders and local officials about the broader impact on the community. His military training had given him an understanding of crisis management, and he asked thoughtful questions about resources, support systems, and long-term planning. Together, they formed a team that combined emotional intelligence with practical concern, addressing both the immediate need for comfort and the longer-term challenges that lay ahead. As the morning visit concluded and they prepared to return to their official duties, Catherine realized that the day had only just begun. Ahead lay the most challenging part of their role, helping to organize a national moment of remembrance that would need to capture the country's grief while pointing toward hope and healing. The tribute they were planning would need to speak to millions of people, each carrying their own relationship with loss and memory. The afternoon brought William and Catherine back to Kensington Palace, where the real work of coordinating the nation's response was taking place. In a conference room that had witnessed countless royal meetings over the decades, they sat around a polished oak table with senior advisors, palace communications experts, and representatives from the Archbishop of Canterbury's office. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of responsibility and the ticking clock of public expectation. Catherine studied the preliminary plans spread across the table, her finger tracing the timeline that palace staff had prepared. The tribute would need to happen quickly while the nation's grief was still raw and immediate, but it also needed to be perfect. There would be no second chances to get this right. Every detail, from the choice of venue to the selection of music, would carry symbolic weight that could comfort or inadvertently cause further pain. The debate centered around timing and scale. Some advisors argued for a more intimate gathering, something that would feel personal and authentic. Others insisted that the magnitude of the loss demanded a larger, more formal ceremony that could accommodate the thousands who would want to participate. William listened carefully to each perspective, occasionally asking questions that cut to the heart of the dilemma they faced. How do you create a moment that feels both grand enough to honor the significance of the loss and intimate enough to provide genuine comfort? The silence will be the most powerful part, Catherine said quietly, her voice cutting through the animated discussion. The room fell quiet as everyone turned to her. She had been thinking about this throughout the morning, remembering other national moments of silence she had participated in, the way they created a shared experience across the entire country. When everyone stops at the same moment, when the whole nation pauses together, that's when people feel connected to something larger than their individual grief. The palace communications director nodded thoughtfully. The challenge would be coordinating with media outlets, government officials, schools, and workplaces to ensure maximum participation. Social media would play a crucial role in spreading the message, but it would need to be handled delicately. The younger generation, who might not naturally tune in to traditional broadcasts, would need to be reached through platforms they actually used, but in a way that felt respectful rather than manipulative. As the planning session continued, Catherine found herself thinking about the families who were experiencing personal loss while the nation mourned publicly. In her work with various charities, she had met countless people dealing with grief, and she understood how complicated it could be when private sorrow intersected with public attention. Some would find comfort in the shared experience, while others might feel overwhelmed or forgotten in the larger narrative. William's phone buzzed with a message from his father's office. The king wanted to be briefed on their progress and had suggestions about the ceremonial aspects of the tribute. The coordination between different levels of the royal family required delicate diplomacy, especially when emotions were running high and everyone wanted to contribute something meaningful to the response. "We need to think about the children," Catherine said, looking up from the notes she had been taking. "How do we help them understand why this matters? How do we make sure they feel included without being frightened?" Her experience as a mother had taught her that children often picked up on adult emotions without understanding the context, and national mourning could be particularly confusing for young people. The education secretary had already been in touch about how schools should handle the tribute. Some head teachers were requesting guidance on age-appropriate ways to explain the situation to their students. Catherine suggested that they provide resources for teachers and parents. Simple language that could help children understand both the sadness of loss and the importance of coming together as a community during difficult times. The guest list for the tribute was becoming another source of careful negotiation. Government ministers, religious leaders, representatives from various communities, and family members of the deceased all needed to be accommodated. But the space they had chosen, while symbolically perfect, had limited capacity. Every invitation sent meant another that couldn't be, and the palace staff were acutely aware that these decisions would be remembered long after the tribute itself. Catherine excused herself briefly to check on their own children who were being looked after by their nanny in another part of the palace. Even in the midst of national crisis, the ordinary rhythms of family life continued. George had questions about why everyone seemed so serious, while Charlotte was more interested in the unusual number of people in suits walking through the palace corridors. Louis, still young enough to be largely unaware of the gravity of the situation, continued playing with his toys as if it were any other day. Explaining the day's events to her own children gave Catherine practice for the broader challenge of communicating with the nation's young people. She found herself using simple, honest language about loss and remembrance, watching their faces to gauge their understanding and comfort level. These conversations reminded her that the tribute they were planning would reach into homes across the country, where similar conversations were taking place between parents and children, teachers and students, friends and neighbors, returning. To the conference room, she found William deep in discussion with the protocol experts about the specific timing of the silence. 2 minutes was traditional, but some argued that in the age of social media and shortened attention spans, 1 minute might be more effective. Others insisted that the full 2 minutes was necessary to create the profound sense of shared experience they were hoping to achieve. The venue had been confirmed, a location that was both accessible to the public and rich with historical significance. The logistics team was already working on security arrangements, transportation, and media coverage. Television networks were being coordinated to ensure that the tribute would be broadcast live across all major channels. Planned to participate by falling silent at the designated time. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine noticed how the process of planning was itself becoming a form of processing grief. Each decision they made, each detail they considered, was a way of channeling their own emotions and those of the nation into something constructive. The act of creating a meaningful tribute was helping everyone involved work through their shock and sadness. The final major decision of the day concerned the words that would be spoken before the silence. Who would deliver them and what would? They say the balance between personal reflection and national representation required careful consideration. The words needed to acknowledge the specific loss while speaking to the broader human experience of mourning and memory. William suggested that they write something together, combining their perspectives as both private individuals experiencing grief and public figures representing the nation. Catherine agreed, knowing that their joint statement would carry more weight than either could achieve alone. As the meeting began to wind down, they started sketching out themes and phrases, testing how different words might sound when spoken aloud to millions of people. The sun was beginning to set over London as the day's planning session concluded. Tomorrow would bring the tribute itself, but tonight, William and Catherine faced the challenge of transforming their carefully laid plans into a moment that would resonate in the hearts and memories of an entire nation. The weight of that responsibility settled on their shoulders as they prepared to spend the evening refining their words and preparing themselves emotionally for what lay ahead. The evening light filtered through the tall windows of William and Catherine's private study as they sat together, working on the words that would introduce the nation's moment of silence. Scattered across the desk were multiple drafts each, representing different approaches to the impossible task of capturing collective grief in language that would speak to every person listening. Catherine read aloud from their latest attempt, testing how the words sounded when spoken rather than simply read. Her voice, usually confident in public settings, carried a slight tremor as she worked through phrases about loss, memory, and the bonds that hold communities together during their darkest hours. William listened intently, occasionally suggesting changes or additions, both of them acutely aware that these words would be quoted, analyzed, and remembered long after tomorrow's tribute ended. "It feels too formal," Catherine said, setting down the page and rubbing her temples. They had been at this 4 hours, and the pressure of getting it exactly right was beginning to show. People need to hear something that feels like it comes from the heart, not from a palace communications department.
Ow.
She was thinking about the elderly woman from the morning's visit, the one who had thanked them for simply being present. The words they chose needed to reach people like her, ordinary citizens who were looking to the royal family for comfort and understanding. William nodded, understanding her frustration. His own experience with public speaking had taught him that the most effective communications were often the simplest ones. Complex language and flowery rhetoric might impress speechwriters, but they rarely connected with people who were experiencing real emotion. The challenge was finding words that were both dignified enough for a formal tribute and genuine enough to provide actual comfort. They decided to step away from the written drafts and simply talk about what the day had meant to them personally. Catherine spoke about the faces she had seen in the crowd, the way people had reached out for connection and reassurance. William reflected on his role as someone who would one day be expected to guide the nation through many such moments, how the responsibility felt both overwhelming and deeply meaningful. As they talked, certain phrases began to emerge naturally. Words about the strength found in shared sorrow, about the way communities come together when individuals feel lost and alone. Catherine found herself thinking about her own experiences with loss, the way grief could feel isolating until you realized that others were walking the same difficult path. William drew on his military experience, the brotherhood that formed among people who faced challenges together. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Their private secretary entered with updates from various government departments and royal households. The logistics for tomorrow's tribute were falling into place, but new challenges were emerging. The public response had been larger than anticipated, with thousands of people planning to gather at the venue, and millions more expected to participate in the silence from their homes, schools, and workplaces. The numbers were both encouraging and daunting. On one hand, the massive public interest showed that the tribute was meeting a genuine need for collective expression of grief. On the other hand, the scale of participation meant that any misstep would be magnified across the entire nation. Catherine felt the familiar flutter of pre-event nerves, the same sensation she had experienced before her wedding, before major speeches, before any moment when she knew millions of eyes would be watching. "Tell me about the international response," William asked, knowing that the tribute would be watched beyond Britain's borders. The global nature of modern communication meant that their words would reach people around the world, some of whom might not fully understand the British context, but would still be moved by the human elements of loss and remembrance. The private secretary reported that several Commonwealth nations were planning to observe the silence simultaneously, creating a wave of remembrance that would circle the globe. Television networks in countries with significant British expat populations were requesting permission to broadcast the tribute live. Social media was already buzzing with plans for people to participate from wherever they happened to be at the designated time. This international dimension added another layer to their preparation. The words they chose needed to work not just for British audiences, but for anyone who might be listening, people with different cultural backgrounds but shared human experiences of love and loss. Catherine suggested they include phrases that would resonate universally, concepts that didn't require deep knowledge of British traditions or royal protocol to understand. As the evening progressed, they found themselves moving away from grand, formal language towards something more conversational and personal. They practiced different ways of acknowledging the specific loss that had prompted the tribute while connecting it to the broader human experience that everyone could relate to. The challenge was being specific enough to honor the individual, being remembered while being universal, enough to speak to everyone's encounters with grief. William's phone rang with a call from his brother Harry, who was calling from California to express his support and ask about the plans. The conversation was brief but meaningful, a reminder that even royal families dealing with their own internal challenges could come together during times of national need. Catherine listened to William's side of the conversation, hearing the warmth and concern in his voice as he updated Harry on their preparations. After the call ended, they returned to their writing with renewed focus. Something about speaking with family, even briefly, had reminded them of what really mattered in moments like these. The tribute wasn't about demonstrating royal protocol or showcasing their public speaking abilities. It was about helping people feel less alone in their sadness, about creating a shared moment that could provide comfort and connection. Catherine suggested they practice the speech aloud, to ensure it would fit properly within the broadcast. Schedule while allowing enough space for the silence that would follow. As William read through their latest draft, she watched his face, noting the places where his voice naturally emphasized certain words or where he paused for breath. These natural rhythms would make the final version more effective than any amount of technical coaching. They made final adjustments to the text, removing phrases that felt unnecessarily complicated and adding words that seemed more natural when spoken aloud. The process felt like sculpting. It's gradually revealing the essential message by removing everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Each word had to earn its place, had to contribute something meaningful to the overall impact. As midnight approached, they finally felt satisfied with what they had created. The speech was shorter than their original drafts, but felt more powerful for its simplicity. It acknowledged the specific circumstances that had brought them together while speaking to the timeless human experiences of loss, love, and the comfort found in community. Most importantly, it would provide a bridge into the silence that would follow, preparing people for that shared moment of reflection and remembrance. Catherine read through the final version one more time, imagining how it would sound tomorrow when delivered to the nation. The words felt right, authentic rather than performative, personal rather than political. They had managed to create something that honored both their roles as public figures and their identities, as people who genuinely cared about the welfare of those they served. Tomorrow would test whether their careful preparation had achieved its goal. But tonight they could rest knowing they had put their hearts into creating something meaningful. Dawn broke gray and solemn over London as the nation prepared for what would become one of its most memorable days of collective mourning. Across the country, millions of people were beginning their morning routines with an unusual awareness of the tribute scheduled for later that day. Radio presenters spoke in hushed, respectful tones about the planned silence. Television news anchors wore black ties and dark clothing as they provided updates on the arrangements in offices, schools, shops, and homes. Conversations had taken on a different quality overnight. People who rarely discussed their feelings were finding themselves talking about loss, memory, and what it meant to be part of a national community. The tribute had become more than just a scheduled event. It had evolved into a focal point for emotions and thoughts that many had been carrying privately since the tragic news broke. Catherine woke early, her mind immediately focusing on the day ahead. Through the bedroom window, she could see that crowds were already beginning to gather along the route they would take to the tribute venue. Some people had clearly spent the night there, wrapped in blankets and holding homemade signs. The dedication of these ordinary citizens, willing to stand for hours in order to be part of something larger than themselves, reminded her of why she had come to love her role despite its challenges. William was already up, speaking quietly on the phone with security coordinators who were managing the unexpected size of the crowds. What had been planned as a manageable public gathering was evolving into something much larger and more significant. Police estimated that over 50,000 people would be in central London by mid-morning, many more lining the streets and gathering in public squares to watch the tribute on large screens. The magnitude of the public response was both inspiring and nerve-wracking. Catherine had participated in many royal events over the years, but she recognized that this was different. The people gathering weren't there for the usual reasons that drew crowds to royal occasions. They weren't celebrating a wedding or a jubilee, weren't hoping for a glimpse of glamorous dresses or historic ceremonies. They were coming together because they needed to process grief collectively, and they were looking to William and Catherine to help them do that as she prepared for the day. Catherine thought about the responsibility this represented. In a few hours, she and William would stand before millions of people and attempt to speak for the nation's sorrow. The words they had crafted the previous evening would need to carry the weight of collective emotion, while providing comfort and hope. The silence that would follow their speech would become a shared national memory, a moment when everyone stopped what they were doing to remember and reflect together. The morning's final preparations took place in a controlled chaos of palace. Efficiency. Speechwriters made last-minute adjustments to pronunciation guides. Protocol experts confirmed the exact timing of each element of the tribute. Security teams coordinated with local police to manage the crowd safely. Communications directors worked with broadcasters to ensure that the moment of silence would be observed across all media platforms. Simultaneously, Catherine's dresser had selected clothing that struck the right balance between formality and accessibility, between royal dignity and human warmth. Every choice, from the color of her coat to the style of her shoes, would be analyzed and interpreted by millions of observers. But more importantly, her appearance needed to reflect the solemnity of the occasion while remaining approachable, enough that ordinary people could see themselves reflected in her emotional response. The drive through London revealed a city transformed by collective motion. Streets that were normally bustling with the usual urban energy had taken on a different atmosphere. People walked more slowly, spoke more quietly, gathered in small groups that seemed to naturally form wherever others were already standing. Construction workers had stopped their machinery. Shop owners had placed signs in their windows expressing sympathy. Even the typically relentless traffic appeared to be moving with unusual patience and courtesy. At red lights, Catherine noticed pedestrians looking toward their car with expressions of gratitude and hope. These weren't the usual royal watchers hoping for a photograph or a wave. These were people who genuinely seemed to need to see their representatives, to confirm that someone was taking their grief seriously and would help them express it appropriately. The weight of that trust settled heavily on her shoulders. The tribute venue was all ready, surrounded by crowds despite the early hour. Barriers had been set up to manage the flow of people, but the atmosphere was remarkably orderly. There was none of the pushy excitement that usually characterized large public gatherings. Instead, people stood quietly, some holding flowers, others simply waiting with the patience that comes from knowing you're part of something important. Inside the venue, final sound checks were being conducted by technicians who understood that every word would need to be heard clearly by both the immediate audience and the millions listening through various media channels. The acoustics had been tested and retested, but in an event where timing was crucial and emotions were high, there was no room for technical failures. Religious leaders from various faiths had gathered to offer their support and to represent the diverse spiritual traditions that would be observing the silence from their own communities. The Archbishop of Canterbury was present, but so were representatives from Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, and Sikh communities, acknowledging that grief crosses all religious and cultural boundaries. Their presence reminded everyone that the tribute needed to speak to the entire nation, not just those who shared specific traditions or beliefs. Government ministers arrived with their own security details and staff, but the usual political posturing seemed absent. Opposition leaders sat near governing party members without the typical partisan divisions. The shared experience of national mourning had temporarily suspended the normal rules of political competition, creating space for genuine cooperation and mutual respect as the official start time approached. Catherine and William took their places for the final briefing with their communications team. The schedule was reviewed one more time, with particular attention to the transition from speech to silence. The timing needed to be perfect to ensure that the entire nation could participate simultaneously, regardless of where they were or how they were receiving the broadcast. Television producers reported that viewing figures were already breaking records, with additional international networks requesting last-minute broadcasting rights. Social media platforms had prepared special features to encourage participation while maintaining the respectful tone that the occasion demanded. Radio stations had cleared their programming schedules, understanding that this was a moment when entertainment needed to step aside for something more important. The final minutes before their public appearance were spent in quiet preparation. William and Catherine reviewed their speech one last time, but mostly they simply sat together, each drawing strength from the other's presence. They had learned over the years of their marriage and partnership that their most effective public moments came when they were genuinely connected to each other and to the purpose they were serving. Outside, the crowd had grown beyond all expectations. Police estimated that over 100,000 people were now gathered in central London alone. With millions more preparing to observe the silence from their own locations across the country, the spontaneous nature of this massive participation demonstrated that the nation truly needed this moment of collective expression as they prepared to step into the public eye and take their place in what would become a defining moment of their public service. Catherine and William understood that they were about to participate in something that would be remembered long after they were gone. The tribute they had planned was no longer just their event. It had become the nation's way of processing grief together, and they were simply the facilitators of something much larger and more powerful than themselves. The moment had arrived. William and Catherine stood together at the podium, looking out over a sea of faces that stretched far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The crowd was so large that many people were watching on screens positioned throughout the area, their images broadcast to ensure that everyone could see the tribute taking place. The silence before they began to speak was profound. Filled with the weight of collective expectation and shared emotion, Catherine felt the familiar pre-speech flutter in her stomach. But this was different from other public appearances. Usual concerns about protocol and presentation seemed trivial compared to the genuine need she could feel radiating from the crowd. These people had come here not to see a performance, but to participate in something meaningful. And she and William were there to serve that need rather than to impress anyone with their royal bearing. William stepped forward first, his voice carrying clearly through the sophisticated sound system that had been tested multiple times throughout the morning. "We gather today not as strangers, but as members of a community bound together by both joy and sorrow," he began, his words measured and sincere. The crowd fell into an even deeper silence, if such a thing were possible, as everyone strained to hear every word. Catherine watched the faces in the crowd as William continued, noting how people seemed to lean forward slightly as if drawing comfort from the simple act of being addressed directly about their grief. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, somehow understanding that this was a moment requiring their attention. Elderly people who had lived through many national tragedies nodded with recognition, seeing in this young royal couple the continuation of traditions that had helped the country through difficult times before. "Loss touches every life," William continued, "but we need not face it alone. Today we pause together, we remember together, and we find strength in the simple fact that we share this moment across our nation and beyond." His words were carefully chosen, but delivered with genuine feeling. The product of their careful preparation the previous evening combined with the real emotion of standing before so many grieving people. When it came time for Catherine to speak, she felt a profound connection to every person listening. Her voice, usually warm and engaging in public settings, took on an additional quality of intimate understanding. "In silence, we sometimes find what words cannot express," she said, her words carrying across the crowd and through the airwaves to millions of listeners. "In shared silence, we discover that we are never truly alone with our sadness." The television cameras captured not just her words, but her expression, the way her eyes seemed to make contact with individuals throughout the crowd. Viewers at home later commented that they felt she was speaking directly to them, addressing their personal experiences of loss while acknowledging the broader community of grief that connected them all. This ability to be simultaneously personal and universal had become one of Catherine's greatest strengths as a public figure. "We invite you now to join us in 2 minutes of silence," William said, his voice carrying the gravity of the moment. 2 minutes to remember, to reflect, and to feel the presence of everyone else who shares this time with us. The precision of the timing had been coordinated with broadcasters, ensuring that radio stations, television networks, and online platforms would all observe the silence simultaneously. As the silence began, something extraordinary happened. The massive crowd, which had been impressively quiet during the speeches, fell into a hush so complete that it seemed to extend beyond the immediate gathering. Car horns stopped honking in the distance. Construction noise ceased. Even the city's ever-present hum of activity seemed to pause in recognition of the moment. Catherine closed her eyes briefly, feeling the power of the shared silence washing over her. She could sense the presence of every person in the crowd, every viewer watching from home, every listener tuned in to radio broadcasts. The silence was not empty but full, packed with memories, emotions, and the simple human need to pause and acknowledge loss together. It was perhaps the most profound 2 minutes of her public life. William kept his eyes open, looking out over the crowd and marveling at what he was witnessing. Hundreds of thousands of people, all from different backgrounds and circumstances, were united in this single moment of reflection. Children stood still beside their parents. Teenagers put away their phones without being asked. Adults who rarely took time for introspection found themselves deep in thought about what really mattered in their lives. The silence extended beyond the immediate venue to millions of homes, schools, offices, and public spaces across the country. Teachers had prepared their students for this moment, explaining its importance and helping them understand how to participate respectfully. Office workers stepped away from their desks to stand by windows, looking out at city streets that had grown unusually quiet. Shoppers in malls paused in their activities, creating pockets of stillness in spaces normally defined by constant movement and noise. International. Observers later noted that this kind of spontaneous, widespread participation was rare in modern society. The ability of two people to invite an entire nation to pause simultaneously spoke to both the deep respect that William and Catherine had earned over the years and the genuine need that people felt for collective expression of grief. Social media posts from around the world showed people participating from their own locations. It's creating a global moment of remembrance that extended far beyond Britain's borders. As the 2 minutes drew to a close, Catherine opened her eyes and looked out over the crowd once more. The faces she saw were different somehow, as if the shared experience had created a bond among strangers. People who had arrived as individuals seemed to have become part of a community united by more than just physical proximity. The silence had done what their words alone could not. It had created genuine connection among people who might never meet but who had shared something profound together. William's voice broke the silence gently, almost reluctantly, as if he too understood that the quiet had become sacred. "Thank you," he said simply, and those 2 words carried more weight than any elaborate conclusion could have managed. The crowd began to stir, but slowly, as if emerging from a dream. They were reluctant to leave behind. The applause that followed was different from the usual enthusiastic clapping that greeted royal appearances. It was quieter, more thoughtful, filled with genuine gratitude rather than mere politeness. People weren't applauding a performance. They were expressing appreciation for an experience that had met a deep emotional need they might not have even recognized before arriving. As Catherine and William prepared to leave the podium, they could see the lasting impact of what had just occurred. People in the crowd were embracing, strangers were speaking to each other, and there was a sense of shared understanding that would extend far beyond this single day. The silence had created something that would echo in the nation's memory, a moment when everyone had paused together and found comfort in their shared humanity. The tribute was officially over. But its effects were just beginning to ripple outward through communities, families, and individual hearts. What William and Catherine had initiated with their words, the nation had completed with its silence, creating a moment that would be remembered as one of the most powerful examples of collective mourning and healing in modern British history. In the days that followed the tribute, letters began arriving at Kensington Palace in unprecedented numbers. Not the usual formal correspondence that royal offices typically received, but deeply personal messages from ordinary people who had been moved by the experience of shared silence. Catherine read many of these letters herself, finding in them confirmation that what they had created had touched something essential in the national consciousness. An elderly woman from Scotland wrote about how the silence had helped her process grief she had been carrying for months after losing her husband. A teacher from Manchester described where students had asked to observe moments of silence in their classroom throughout the following week. A father from Wales explained how the tribute had given him the courage to talk to his teenage children about loss and memory in ways he had never managed before. The international response was equally profound. Messages arrived from Commonwealth nations, from British communities living abroad, and from people who had no direct connection to Britain, but who had been moved by witnessing what collective mourning could look like when done with dignity and genuine emotion. The simple act of pausing together had apparently spoken to something universal about human experience and the need for community during difficult times. William found himself reflecting on how the tribute had changed his understanding of royal duty. For years, he had approached public service with a sense of obligation and responsibility, understanding that his role required him to represent the nation during important moments. But the experience of the silence had shown him something deeper: the power of authentic connection. Between public figures and the people they served, the media coverage in the following days focused less on the technical aspects of the event and more on its emotional impact. Journalists who usually analyzed royal appearances for fashion choices or protocol missteps instead found themselves writing about the genuine feeling that had been present in that moment of silence. Television commentators spoke about how rare it had become in modern society to witness such widespread participation in a shared experience. Catherine discovered that the tribute had affected her own relationship with public duty in unexpected ways. She had always understood the importance of her role, but the depth of gratitude expressed in the letters she received revealed how much people genuinely needed the leadership and comfort that she and William could provide. The responsibility felt heavier, but also more meaningful than it had before. One letter particularly moved her, written by a young mother who had been struggling with postpartum depression and had felt isolated in her sadness until the moment of national silence made her realize that everyone carries grief, and that sharing it, even silently, could provide comfort. The woman credited the tribute with helping her seek support and begin her recovery, a reminder that public moments could have deeply private consequences. The palace staff noticed changes in how William and Catherine approached their subsequent engagements. They seemed more present, more emotionally available, as if the tribute had reminded them that their primary job was not to be seen but to see others. Not to be impressive, but to be genuinely helpful. Their interactions with people during public appearances took on a different quality. It's more focused on individual connection and less on moving efficiently through crowds. Schools across the country began incorporating lessons about community, grief, and collective healing into their curricula, using the tribute as an example of how societies can come together during difficult times. University researchers started studying the phenomenon of mass participation in moments of silence, trying to understand what psychological and social needs were being met by these shared experiences. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had participated in the tribute, later spoke about how the silence had demonstrated the continuing relevance of contemplative practices in an increasingly noisy world. Religious leaders from various faiths noted similar observations, suggesting that the tribute had revealed a hunger for meaningful pause and reflection that transcended specific religious traditions. Mental health professionals reported an increase in people seeking counseling and support in the weeks following the tribute, but not because it had caused distress. Instead, the shared experience of acknowledging grief publicly seemed to have given people permission to address their own emotional needs more directly. The silence had somehow made it acceptable to admit sadness and seek help. As weeks passed, the tribute began to influence other national responses to tragedy and loss. When subsequent sad events occurred, there were calls for similar moments of shared reflection, with people specifically requesting that William and Catherine lead these observances. They had inadvertently created a new model for national mourning, one that emphasized participation over observation, feeling over formality. Catherine often returned to the memory of those 2 minutes when she faced challenging moments in her royal duties. The experience had shown her what was possible when authentic emotion was allowed to exist alongside public responsibility. The faces she had seen in the crowd, the sense of connection that had filled the silence, became a touchstone for understanding what her role could achieve at its best. William similarly drew strength from remembering the tribute when faced with the inevitable criticisms and pressures that came with public life. The genuine gratitude expressed by so many people reminded him that beneath all the protocol and procedure, royal service was fundamentally about being present for others. During moments when presence mattered most, the tribute had also strengthened their partnership, both personal and professional, working together to create something meaningful. Under intense pressure had deepened their understanding of each other's strengths and their ability to complement each other in public service. They had discovered that their most effective contributions came not from individual excellence but from genuine collaboration. Years later, historians would mark the tribute as a turning point in how the British royal family connected with the public, a moment when ancient institutions demonstrated their continued relevance by facilitating authentic human connection. But for William and Catherine, the lasting impact was more personal. The knowledge that when they spoke from the heart and trusted the British people to respond with equal sincerity, something beautiful and healing could emerge from even the darkest moments. The silence they had invited had indeed echoed through the nation, but it had also echoed through their own understanding of service, duty, and the profound privilege of being trusted to help others navigate the universal experiences of loss, love, and hope. In learning to serve the nation's grief, they had discovered depths in themselves and in their relationship with the people they represented that would inform every public moment that followed.